This is the Foxeer Apollo. It's a new camera from Foxeer for the DJI digital FPV system. And I've set myself out here in the cold with no coat and the sun going down over the ridge, losing light, because I think today, in this day and age, you can review a DJI FPV camera so fast, it's not even gonna matter. I'm Joshua Bardwell. You're gonna learn something today. The product that I'm reviewing today was sent to me by the manufacturer for this review. I did not purchase it with my own money. I have not received any cash or any other form of compensation in exchange for this video, and no one has had any approval or preconditions on the contents of this video before it was released. The first thing you got to ask yourself when you're shopping for a DJI FPV camera is it a 60 FPS camera or a 120 FPS camera? If you've watched a bunch of my other reviews and you've heard me harp on this before, just look down in the timeline where there's chapter markers and skip to the next chapter. The 60 FPS cameras have higher latency. They have 35 to 45 milliseconds of latency under normal conditions, whereas the 120 FPS cameras have between 25 and 35 milliseconds of latency. That sounds like a small number, but it absolutely matters. Every little bit of latency matters down to a point. The other disadvantage of the 60 FPS cameras is that they only come in 16:9 mode. You cannot switch them to 4:3 mode. We will do a field of view comparison later in the video so you can see what that actually means to you, practically speaking. And they do not have adjustable image settings like saturation, exposure, and so forth, white balance. You can change those settings on the 120 FPS cameras. You can't on the 60 FPS cameras. But the big deal breaker for a lot of people that steers them away from 60 FPS cameras is the latency. If you do racing with DJI, yeah, some people do that. Or if you do like really hard proximity freestyle, you definitely want a 120 FPS camera. In fact, why wouldn't you want a 120 FPS camera? I don't know. Because the image quality of the 120 FPS cameras is also significantly better under most conditions, and we will have some sample footage for you to check out. Oh my God, the sun's going down, I gotta hurry. The other big reason why you might choose a 60 FPS camera is price. They are a little less expensive, and sometimes the 120 FPS cameras are out of stock, so you just decide to settle. This is a 60 FPS camera, and so for many people, that's the end of the video. One thing I have to get out of the way is that Foxeer advertises this camera as having 3 milliseconds low latency. And honestly, I think that's a little bit misleading. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's intentional, but it certainly could lead people to believe that the Foxeer Apollo camera has much less latency than any other 60 FPS camera on the market. That is absolutely not true. All DJI 60 FPS cameras have the same 35 to 45 milliseconds latency due to the actual DJI video transmitter that they have to go through. That's just the latency of the link. The Foxeer camera has 3 milliseconds of like internal latency between the lens and the sensor and the output. And we really have no way of knowing whether that's good or bad because nobody cares about that number. Nobody advertises that number. And yeah, so don't get the wrong impression from this 3 millisecond claim. So the Foxeer Apollo is a 60 FPS camera, and if that doesn't disqualify it for you, the next question you're going to ask is, how is the image quality? You're looking at it right now. I want to encourage you to watch this video in 4K resolution, even if you're not watching it on a 4K screen. That will increase the bitrate that YouTube sends to you and make, for a camera comparison, you really need all of the bitrate you can get. The first thing I noticed about this camera was the lens flare. You're seeing it right here as we go through the sun, and you'll see it at other times in the video. This camera can be ordered with one of two lenses, a standard lens or a ultra-large starlight, a nighttime lens that lets more light in, and we will do a nighttime comparison later in the video. I think that lens flare is because of the large camera elements, and I suspect that the standard camera wouldn't have as bad a lens flare. The other thing I noticed about this, and you're going to see me testing it here by yawing left and right, is there is a ton of distortion. Look at the barn. Look at everything as it gets to the edge of the screen. It really distorts, and this is super noticeable when doing yaw moves. I got used to it. In fact, I really came to like the ultra-wide field of view of this lens, but boy, the distortion is so noticeable. As far as the overall image quality goes, I have to say this has become one of my favorite images of all the 60 FPS DJI cameras that I've flown. And in some ways, I even prefer it to the Nebula Pro or the original DJI camera. It is a little bit more saturated, it's a little bit more contrasty, and you do lose a little bit of shadow detail as a result. But I find the colors to be really pleasant, the reds and greens, and it almost has a little bit of a warm color cast that some people may find. It's objectively not neutral, but I really find it pleasant to fly. It seems to have good detail, and maybe the wide angle field of view is helping offset some of the 16:9 wide aspect ratio. Again, we're going to do a field of view comparison later in the video as well. Oh my God, there's that lens flare again. What the F? You can work with it, but it's not great. It's really not great. And here I'm going to do what I'll call the pure scraggle test. I'm flying into this wooded area. I don't know the path through this. I am just using the camera image to try to see the scraggle branches and feel my way through. This is pure test of how the camera shows image to you and gives you information that you need to fly and avoid obstacles. And frankly, despite the lens flare, it did a pretty good job. I was able to get through here no problem. And you can decide for yourself how you think that image compares to the other cameras that we're going to see. Finally, this test where we fly behind the barn shows how the camera's exposure algorithm works. We're going from a brighter area into a darker area, and you can see how the camera sort of opens up and closes down again as we go from bright to dark to bright. Now we come to the original DJI camera, which is very, very similar to the Nebula Pro, if that's the camera that you have available. And the first thing we're going to see is the lens flare is much, much better in this camera. The colors in the image are also much more natural. Whether you like that better or not, that's up to you. Bear in mind that because the image settings of this camera are configurable, you could increase the saturation and change the white balance and bring it a little bit closer to what you're seeing in the Foxeer Apollo, although it probably wouldn't be exactly the same. You can also see as I do this yaw turn that there is nowhere near as much distortion as at the edges of the image. And again, we are going to do a field of view comparison later. This probably has less field of view, so that may have something to do with it. Here we are flying through these trees, so you can get a sense of how much detail is provided by looking at the branches. I've always thought that the original DJI camera seems to have a little bit more usable resolution than the other sensors that I've seen used, but I don't have any data to prove that. In this view, you can take a look at the shadows and see how much contrast and how much shadow detail there in the image. And then finally, we're going to do that behind the house test where you can see how the exposure algorithm works. Here we are in a bright area. The exposure is relatively open. Now take a look at that shadow behind the barn and see how it's opened up and you get the shadow detail. So you can see sort of how smooth, how disruptive or not disruptive that seems to you about. I think it does a pretty good job of changing when it needs to change and giving you the detail that you need to see where you're going while you're flying. And finally, we've got the pure scraggle test. Again, flying into this scraggle area, just feeling it out, trying to avoid those branches, trying to avoid having to go get my quad out of the woods. And I do, in fact, make it through. I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to go back and sort of do a side-by-side comparison of the Apollo under these same conditions and test my sort of theory that the original DJI camera, which we're looking at now, has just a little bit more resolution, usable resolution. I don't know. It just seems that way to me. And before too long, we do, in fact, make it out of the woods and on to the next camera. Now let's take a look at the field of view of the cameras, and I've set up a color chart as well so you can get a sense of how the cameras are handling the different colors. This is the Foxeer Apollo. Take a look at the sides and the top and bottom of the image so you get a sense of what kind of field of view it's got. Now we come to the original DJI camera, and this is really interesting because the DJI camera is in 4:3 aspect ratio, and that means it's got a much taller vertical field of view than almost any 16:9 camera. But if you stick a wide enough angle lens on a 16:9 camera, you will get a similar vertical field of view, and in fact that seems to be what Foxeer has done with the Apollo. If we go back and forth between the Apollo and the Vista, you can clearly see that the Apollo is a little bit more zoomed in. It is not quite as wide a field of view, but it's closer than any other 16:9 camera that I've seen. And to make that point, here is the Caddx Polar, which has a significantly narrower vertical field of view and a slightly narrower horizontal field of view than the Apollo. Also, again, that sort of greenish color tint is there as well. I couldn't resist. Here we are in Premiere's color workspace, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mask off this clip. This is the Foxeer Apollo. I'm going to mask off just this neutral gray part of the color chart, and then take a look at the waveform here, and we can see that it is skewed heavily towards red and away from blue. So it is a much sort of redder image. That is what my sense was. And here, looking at the polar, if we do the same thing, we can see the polar is skewed heavily towards blue and green and away from red. So it has a bluish greenish image. And then finally, we'll do the same thing for the Vista. And on the Vista, it is closest to neutral with a slight tendency towards red and away from blue, but overall pretty neutral. Bear in mind that could have a lot to do with the color temperature of the light that's hitting it, but we at least have a sense of how these different cameras are relative to each other. Finally, here's the low light test, and we're going to start out here on my porch under these. It's relatively bright lighting. I mean, not in the sense of photographic lights, but in the sense of a nighttime camera. This is plenty of light, and even the Vista, the original DJI camera, or any normal non-low light camera would do fine up on the porch. But when we go out here into the dark, that's where things start to get challenging. And I'm going to walk all the way down to the edge of the path. We can see we've got a bright moonlit night here. It's a full moon, or nearly, though, so it's brighter than some nights when I've done this test. And we can try to look for how much detail we're getting in the starry sky, how the exposure algorithm is handling the bright lights of the porch at the same time as the dark sky. Looking up here into the sky, I mean, we're not getting a ton of detail. We can see the shadows of the trees against the sky. We can see barely any detail in the path. We can see some detail in the fence. I feel like this is probably better than the Vista camera, which I haven't, it's not in this test because it's really just garbage at night. It's not falling apart, but the Polar is a lot better. And somehow the Polar seems to be better at highlights. Like the individual light bulbs are not blown out, and the moon is not like this giant glowing ball. So it's better in the highlights, but it's also better in the shadows. It just has a much, much better dynamic range. If you look at the sky is significantly brighter in the Polar image. It's just picking up more light from the night sky. You're seeing more stars, more actual stars. You can actually make them out, whereas with the Apollo, you couldn't. And you are seeing more sort of digital image noise in the Polar. It is having to crank the gain of the sensor a little bit, but it's just definitely giving you a ton more shadow detail. Like you can make out the branches on that tree in the yard, and it's just the Polar is just destroying the Apollo in terms of nighttime performance. There's just no competition. So we come to the end of the video, and as always, the question, should you buy it? And in order to answer that question, I've pulled out my phone and I've looked up the price of the Foxeer Apollo camera, and it is about $50. Compare that to well, I think the gold standard for cameras right now is the Caddx Nebula Pro or the original DJI camera. Caddx Nebula Pro, $60. DJI camera, $60. Okay, I don't understand why anybody would pay $10 less to get the Foxeer Apollo or any other 60 FPS camera when they could have the legit DJI camera, which is 120 FPS. You like the more saturated look of the Apollo? You can turn the saturation up in the original camera. I don't understand. Stop making 60 FPS cameras or give them to us for a much, much bigger discount, everybody. That's it. Links to the video, oh right, links in the video description. They are affiliate links. And what that means is when you make any purchase at the affiliated vendor, after you click that link, I get a small commission. If I've helped you make a buying decision, if I've helped you solve a problem, a very, very easy way for you to pay that back is to just click those affiliate links before you make any purchase, any of your shopping. Doesn't have to be a specific product. Anytime you shop, click the affiliate link, do your shopping, check out, I get a little commission. There's other ways you can support me as well, but that is the simplest and easiest one, and it does mean a lot. Thank you so much for watching. Happy flying. Screw you, son! Huh! What are you doing in here? The least you could do is subscribe or join my Patreon or, like, just, here's another video I picked out for you. Jeez.